This learning module combines the information from Chapter 7 on social stratification and Chapter 8 on social class. So in order to prepare for this module, you will have two videos from the part of the social stratification chapter that you were required to read, and then you'll have three videos to cover the information from the Chapter 8 on social class. So this is the first video from Chapter 7 on social stratification. So to start talking about this material, we're going to discuss how to read some graphs and what these graphs are telling us together. And graphs are going to play a pretty big role in the material that we'll be covering for this particular learning module. So the first graph that we look at, you can tell by the title of the graph, is looking at historical U.S. income inequality. And it goes from 1967 to 2011. The dollars have been adjusted for inflation, so it's in 2011 dollars. And it breaks the population up into quintiles as well as the top 5%. So the first question that I sometimes get when I present this material in class is, what is a quintile? So the best way to think about a quintile is if you lined up all of the American households from who has the highest incomes to who has the lowest incomes, and you split them into fifths, so 20%, then the lowest quintile is the bottom 20%, the second quintile is the next 20%, the third quintile is the one right there in the middle, the fourth quintile. And then, even though they don't have the fifth quintile in there, that is the top 20%. And instead of having the fifth quintile, instead they just show the top 5%. So when you are reading the graph, what you want to look at for income inequality is what has happened to the average income of these quintiles over time. So one thing you might notice is which quintiles have improved, which ones have not improved, which ones have largely remained stagnant. So as you can see here, the lowest quintile as well as kind of the second quintile have largely remained stagnant. In the second quintile, you can even see a small dip there towards the end. And so how do you interpret this? Because a big part of reading graphs is actually interpreting what they're saying. So if they have the bottom 20% has roughly had the same amount of money in their household from 1967 to 2011. Why is that important? How does their experience, how is that different in 2011 than what it would have been in 1967? Well, if you're thinking that the cost of living in society has gone up since 1967, and therefore, while they are not technically poorer, they might feel poorer, that is kind of the correct answer here, right? Think about all the things that have increased in costs. A lot of services, certainly rent, the cost of gas. So if those homes in 2011 dollars have about $18,000 in those homes, 18,000 gets you a lot. In 1967, it would have gotten you a lot farther than it would in 2011. And with the third quintile, we see a lot of bumpy movement in that quintile in those kind of 80s years. And then we see some decline, towards the end. And that speaks a lot to who is in this third quintile. So this is the group that when we talk about the middle class, lower middle class, this is a group that we're kind of referring to. This is kind of the statistically the average American. The 50% mark falls in the third quintile. And so what we know is as we came out of the 70s into the 80s, deindustrialization sped up, factories took a hit, people that were able to go to college or kind of invest in additional technical skills, they kind of moved maybe up a quintile into the fourth quintile. But otherwise, if you were a factory worker, factory foreman even, those types of industries, the opportunities as well as their associated income took a hit during the deindustrialization era. And so people kind of felt the squeeze during that time period. And this is almost the opposite of what was happening in the fourth quintile, because it was during the late 80s, early 90s, up until around 1999, that we saw that kind of great return on educational investment. And a lot of people, although certainly not all, people who are in the fourth quintile probably got there through investing in their education. And the kind of final takeaway from this kind of graph on income inequality is that the top 5%, which, was a little over 100,000 in 1967. So the disparity between being in the bottom and being in the top 5% has dramatically grown. They've experienced a 66% increase, although you can see there were some years where they had some slight bumps and declines, but still, compared it to every other group, this group has received kind of like steady gains, even when the rest of the country during those recession years instead maybe decreased. And so we call this income inequality, right? Like how equally are is income spread in our society. But perhaps even more so than income inequality in the United States, what has been maybe a larger topic of conversation, and depending on your perspective or view on that, maybe also a larger cause for concern, is wealth inequality. And although we'll go over in more detail later in this presentation the distinction between income and wealth, there is worth noting that if wealth are your assets, deducted from that, what you owe. So assets such as homes, land, stocks, bonds, businesses. When we look at who has the largest share of wealth in the United States, that would be kind of the top 1% of households who have roughly about 43% of the nation's assets. And then if you consider the next 4%, then it's 29% of the assets. And then the next 15%, 21% of the assets. So all that together, 1, 4, 15, that is that top quintile. So the top 20% of American households have about 93% of our nation's assets, primarily in the fund, in the form, of stocks and bonds, businesses. When people talk about their investment portfolio, these are people that have very deep and diversified investment portfolios, probably maybe a lot more than those of us who perhaps have our pensions or our 401ks, or dabble a little bit with stocks and bonds. Most Americans, in fact 80% of Americans, that 7% of the wealth that we own, what is in the average American's kind of wealth column, possibly is their home. Home equity is really key in this country in terms of owning a piece of the wealth pie, if you will. And that is why when the housing bubble burst at the start of the recession, why it hit so many Americans so hard, because of course it's not your home, it's not an asset until you own it fully outright. So for people who are still paying mortgages, technically that means that the bank owns your home, and some families in America experienced this the hard way during the recession when their homes were foreclosed. So that is what the distribution of wealth looks like. So if the question is, in this country, we have both income inequality and wealth inequality, but our wealth inequality greatly exceeds our income inequality. And we'll talk more about that in later presentations. And this is just a survey that just kind of demonstrates that while Americans are somewhat aware that we have wealth inequality, they are actually largely ignorant of the extent to which that inequality exists. Like, so to the average person who doesn't study this, isn't having to take a class, there is some sense, of course, that the wealthy have a good deal more assets than the average person in America. But the extent to which that wealth distribution actually is unequal, a lot of people are not accurate in their estimate. And so all of this is just to introduce this idea about economic inequality, that the distributions of resources in America, and the second half of chapter 7, which I'm not requiring you to read, but you are welcome to read if you so choose, also makes the point that, this economic inequality exists in all countries. It really just becomes a question of to what extent, how large is the disparity, how unequal is it? So that's why I note here it does exist in all societies, and oftentimes it's related to other social inequalities. And that is why social inequality, right, a disparity in income, wealth, power, prestige, and other resources, is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. It goes beyond just economic inequality. Economic inequality is certainly one part of it, but it is also about who has greater access to educational opportunities, who's most likely to vote and to run for political office and thus have power, who enjoys status and prestige in our society so that people look up to them and they receive additional social capital just kind of based on who they are, the type of job that they have. So we're going to be talking about this social inequality. But it's worth just thinking about, when we think about how we got to where we are, even in terms of just the economic inequality, this is where, if you haven't taken history classes, then you might be a little bit at a disadvantage, because if you have taken history classes, then you probably have a greater sense of why people of color, particularly Native Americans, Latinos, and African Americans, are less likely to be wealthy and more likely to be in the lower quintiles. You probably would have a greater understanding if you've studied history as to why female headed households, even more so than male headed households, are less likely to be in those upper quintiles. And how the impact of kind of the changing economy has hit different parts of America in different ways. So I already kind of indicated that for people that were in the third quintile, deindustrialization and the disappearance of those good union factory jobs certainly kind of led to greater inequality between the kind of working class, middle class Americans and people that are in the upper classes. So certainly, if this is something that if you find interesting, if you would like to talk about further, if you would like for me to direct some resources your way, I strongly suggest reaching out to me, and I am happy. I'm happy to assign you more reading. But just know that there are both historical as well as contemporary explanations that not so much justify the inequality that we have in America, but at least explains how it came into existence and why, and what shaped it to be what it is. So, going back to our discussion of social inequality, we start talking about this because up until this point in the semester, in this course, we've talked about society, whether it's culture, whether it's social structure, whether it's socialization, as if we all kind of experience society the same way. But because we don't have the same amount of resources in society, whether that's prestige, whether that's wealth, whether that's power, that means that we actually do experience society and are perceived by society in differing ways, and we have differing experiences. And this introduces kind of the main concept of Chapter 7, which is the role of stratification systems. So, Social stratification systems are the direct contributor to social stratification. So it is the systematic ranking of different groups of people in a hierarchy of inequality. I always encourage students to think about this as a ladder, and at the top of the ladder, there's all the good stuff, whether it's money, whether it's power, whether it's prestige, but that stuff is at the top of the ladder. So your ability to access that good stuff and how much of it you can grab is somewhat based on which rung of the ladder are you on. Are you on one of the bottom lower rungs, or are you on the top rungs? And are you able to move from rung to rung, or are you pretty much stuck on the rung that you are born into? And so in sociology, we call that either a closed or open stratification system. If you are stuck on the rung that you are born into, that is a closed system. There is no mobility, and your ability to access the good stuff at the top is largely defined, by an ascribed characteristic, the status that you're born into. But in an open system where there is some mobility, there is some movement, this system does mean that you have the possibility of gaining access or better access to the good stuff at the top over time. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the class system. Because there are four main systems of stratification: slavery, caste, estate, and class. And of those four, the first three, slavery, caste, and estate, are largely closed systems, while the class system, while not perfectly open, is the only system that has any real level of openness. But let's first talk a little bit about slavery. So your book makes the point that although, especially here in America, because of what slavery was largely based on in the New World, we sometimes associate this solely with race. So slavery in our mind is very racialized. But it's worth noting that slavery has been a form of a lot of human societies for a very long time. And that historically, race was not one of the primary causes for slavery in most parts of the world. Before it became an essential part of the slave system in the New World. Instead, the primary causes, as your book discusses, is debt. If you owed money to a person or to, the society itself, the government itself, you could find yourself enslaved. Crime, that is one way to not have a massive prison population, is historically there were certainly some societies where you basically would be enslaved if you committed a crime. And then maybe the most common one, as a consequence of war. So if my tribe beat your country or tribe, then certainly some people were taken as slaves. Now, slavery in the New World, and none of this was necessarily racialized. Your book makes the point that there were other ways in which this old slavery was unique, that possibly it wouldn't necessarily last your lifetime. That slave status definitely, in the case of debt and crime, did not pass on to innocents such as your children. And then in the case of war, that captors who had children with their captives, oftentimes the child would take on the status of being a non-slave and not necessarily a slave. And, anyone with any kind of basic knowledge of the American slave system knows that all of that kind of flies in the face of how slavery wound up being practiced and enacted in the New World. So let's talk a little bit about the New World slavery. So, it's worth noting that initially there was a lot of blurring of the lines in the early years in America between slaves and indentured servants. And so certainly people who had committed crimes in Europe, people who had been put in debtor's prison, or just people who really wanted to start over in the New World but did not have the money, entered into this country as indentured servants, meaning that they agreed to work and not collect wages for an agreed upon amount of time. And then when that amount of time had passed, that they then would be free to, live and work and earn money as any citizen. And there was certainly early examples of indentured servant status being granted to not just Europeans, but also some Africans, as well as Native Americans. However, over time, in those early years of America, indentured servitude, particularly for people of African descent, kind of hardened into slavery. And this was both for philosophical reasons related to racial superiority, as well as economic reasons, because indentured servitude did mean that you had to, every 7, 10, 13 years, replace your indentured servant with more indentured servants. And similar to what I said before, that status of indentured servitude did not necessarily pass on to your children, right? So you couldn't create a lineage of indentured servants. And so economically, it was not as profitable of a system. And then you combine that with kind of growing interest in the idea, the concept of race, which we will talk about more when we get to chapter 9, and beliefs about both religion and the concept of heathens, as well as beliefs about racial superiority. What you start to have in America in the late 1700s, and what it hardened into by the early 1800s, was largely race-based slavery, where instead of there being the kind of universal opportunity for people to serve their time and then go out into the world as full citizens. Instead, in race-based slavery, largely based on your race, you kind of became chattel for life, and your children were chattel for life and did not belong to you. And if you had a child from a master or from someone who was white, that instead of that child taking their status as being a non-slave, instead they took the status of slave. And so that is largely what made slavery in the New World unique. So that is kind of the kind of old versions of slavery, both the New World and the Old World. Do we still have slavery today? We do. Your book makes the point that when you talk about human trafficking, and whether it is based on, people's need for labor or sex trafficking, this is what we would consider today to be modern slavery. And it exists in all parts of the world, including here in America. So obviously, if you think about this ladder, at the top of the ladder are slave owners. At the bottom of the ladder are slaves. In the middle are people who are not slaves but are also not slave owners, because they are going to be limited in their ability to access the good stuff at the top of the ladder by the fact that they have to work for it, that they don't own people kind of doing that work for them. So that is the slavery stratification system, which is largely a closed system. Next, we have the caste system. And they're kind of, in the caste system, once again, it's based on an ascribed status. You are born into a specific caste. And once again, it's largely a closed system in the sense that there is limited opportunity for you to move out of your caste, and therefore to gain greater access to the good stuff in society. And so there are kind of three examples you can think of with the caste system. There's India's religious caste system, which you see a kind of graphical depiction of there with the pyramid. People are born into a specific religious caste. It kind of sets the tone for the work that they do in society, the amount of education they will receive, their level of prestige, who they interact with, who they marry. This caste system in India has diminished in importance and significance over the last few decades. Next, we have the South African apartheid system. Which existed through the 80s, and this was a system in Africa where at the top of the caste system you had the white Afrikaners, and then at the bottom of the stratification system you had the Africans, the native Africans, and in the middle you had what they call the coloreds, which would be everything from Indians as well as, in some cases, biracials. And so, once again, very similar to the India's religious caste system, you're born in the caste you are. It limits where you live, it controls the type of jobs and education you have access to, it limited your ability to hold powerful positions, and it structured your interactions with people in positions of power, like the police and government officials. And so, if you've never heard of the South African apartheid system, what you really want to think about it really is just a version of the same system we had in the United States in the South during the Jim Crow period. So during the time of de jure segregation, where the races were segregated, whites and blacks, in almost every conceivable way. Where they sat on the bus, where they ate at the lunch counter, where they sat in movie theaters, what water fountains, what they drank out of, what bathrooms they used, what schools they sent their children. All of this was separated not by choice, but by actual law. And so that is the caste system that largely existed in a lot of southern states well into the early 70s, late 70s, and wasn't really dismantled. It wasn't even beginning to be dismantled, of course, until the 60s during the civil rights movement. And so the South African apartheid system, the U.S. Racial caste system during Jim Crow, and India's religious caste systems are all examples of the largely closed caste stratification system. The last of the largely closed systems is the estate system, which pretty much exists primarily in Europe, and that's what we're calling their feudal system, where you have nobility like the king, and then under the king and queen and those royals, you have the nobles, and then you have kind of the clergy and knights. Under them, and then you have the commoners, the peasants, the serfs at the bottom. And so you'll see that there is this relationship between, the what each group provided the group over it, and then what that person over it provided the group under it. And a lot of this was based around, land and protection. And so the estate system, while not 100% closed, you could be a particularly strong, brave, young peasant, and maybe that strength catches the eye of your nobleman, and they make you a knight. You could be a very pretty peasant woman, and maybe you catch the eye of a knight, sometimes even a noble. So there was a little bit of mobility here, but it was still largely a closed system. And once again, for a lot of people, they died in the same position that they were born into. So there wasn't a lot of movement in those rungs of the ladder. And so, kind of the final thoughts before I end this presentation, and next presentation is going to be all about the class system. It's just really kind of setting up this difference between the class system and these other systems, particularly the caste system, just because the slavery and estate systems are pretty limited in time and space and place, while the caste system has existed in multiple forms across multiple countries across time. So a lot of this I've already said. In a caste system, social levels are closed, and individuals largely remain at the social level of their birth throughout their life. And that level is based on some personal characteristic present at birth. Their race, their ethnicity, their parental religion, their parental caste. Mobility is virtually impossible. While in a class system, social mobility exists. So someone can change their economic position. They can move up or down the rungs of the ladder. And so class position is now based on achieve rather than ascribe status. And particularly, usually that achieve status relates to things such as achievement in areas such as education and occupation. And so instead of being a largely closed system in a class society, class position is relatively fluid. Boundaries between classes can be crossed. And so that is our introduction to the last of the stratification systems, the class system. Part 2 of Chapter 7 is going to go into a lot more detail about the class system, as well as in general why stratification pretty much exists in all societies, looking at the functionalist view of that question as well as the conflict view of that question.